On a rainy winter's morning on July the 3rd, 1963, Flight 441 was preparing for a routine trip from Auckland's Whenuapai Airport. Despite a forecast of 35-knot winds, the flight was cleared for takeoff. But unforeseen, 150 kilometres away, the weather was rapidly deteriorating. Unsuspecting passengers boarded NAC's DC-3 Skyliner bound for Tauranga. They were expecting luxury all the way, but it wasn't to be. Just 2 minutes out from their destination, the pilots were caught in a powerful downdraft. Then all communication was lost. Flight 441 had disappeared. Appalling conditions prevented desperate attempts to find the missing aircraft, but after just over 24 hours of searching, the plane was found. Amongst the mangled, burnt-out wreckage, what was the fate of the 23 passengers and crew aboard? My dad's a pilot and I've been lucky enough to be around aeroplanes all my life. And I've spent time flying along the Kaimai Ranges, and I know just how dangerous that place can be. The crash of Flight 441 from Auckland to Tauranga is still remembered as New Zealand's worst internal air disaster. In 1963, air travel in New Zealand was booming. Even with new planes coming into service, the newly formed national airline NAC maintained more than 20 post-war Douglas DC-3s. An iconic aircraft, it continued to provide accessible air travel on the provincial routes around the country. Going for a passenger flight in a DC-3 Skyliner was a big deal. It wasn't jandals and t-shirts, it was hats and bags and suits. Air travel was very glamorous, but one flight would also be deadly. Just after 8 a.m. on July the 3rd, passengers were called to board Flight 441 bound for Tauranga. One of the first to board was 22-year-old Graham Flyger, a travelling salesman for the Burley Lingerie Company. He was heading off on a week-long sales trip. Meanwhile, in the departure lounge, 20-year-old able seaman Tutu Grace was anxiously waiting on standby. He was urgently heading to Gisborne to attend his nephew's tangi. After being given clearance for takeoff, the DC-3 was wheels up at 8:21 a.m. in light rain. 43 minutes into the flight, they called air traffic control in Tauranga. The plane was at 5,500 feet and would be arriving in just 4 minutes. But what they didn't report was that they were flying blind in heavy cloud. Moments later, at 9:06, there was another call.
Tauranga, we are 2 minutes out. Request ascent to 4,100 feet. Alpha Yankee Zulu, this is Tauranga. You are clear to join Tauranga at 4,100 feet. Clear to join Tauranga at 4,100 feet, vacating 5,500 feet.
But then there was silence. That was the last that was ever heard of Flight 441. After several minutes, an ashen-faced flight controller turned to his colleague and said, "I've lost an aircraft." The 23 passengers and crew on board Flight 441 came from all parts of New Zealand and all backgrounds. This marae near Ruatoria is home to the whānau of Tutu Grace, who was an able seaman in the Royal New Zealand Navy.
He was someone to look up to, Tora was. We were proud of him. He was more than just a brother. Yeah, he was like a father as well.
After the death of his 3-year-old nephew, Tuta desperately needed to return home to his marae in time for the burial. At Whenuapai Airport, all flights for that week were fully booked. But finally Tuta was given a ticket. Due to the bad weather, last-minute seats had become available. It would be a tragic twist of fate. Tuta Grace boarded flight 441.
He said there's been a late cancellation and he's going to be home that very afternoon. We were excited because he's going to be there on that same day.
July 3rd, 1963 is a date that's etched in Queenie's memory.
The weather changed and it got so bad that it was so loud. The pelting of the rain and the howling of the wind. It seemed as if trees were banging against the marae.
As the day wore on, Tuta's anticipated arrival never came.
And we thought, oh, maybe it might come in the morning. They might have slipped over because the weather's too bad. And through all of that, I think we were silently worried for Tuta. Just hoping, oh, okay, maybe they didn't fly.
Early the next morning, a visitor arrived at the marae.
I remember sitting there like that, the window, and it was looking down the paddock, and then I saw the police car pull up, and the policeman proceed towards the marae. We sort of knew. I think we sort of knew. We sort of held our breaths, And when our father came in and told us that Tuta's plane is missing, the way he said it, I can still see him standing there and tell us, and we're sort of like shock-bound. I was looking out the window and looking amongst the mist and just thinking, where are you, my poor brother? You're in there. You were somewhere lost in there.
The family had been waiting for Tuta's arrival before beginning the tangi for his nephew. But by mid-morning, torrential rain was filling the freshly dug grave. They were advised that the burial must proceed.
He was taken up to the graveside and he had to be lowered down into this water grave. My mother was really crying and she was sort of smoothing out the dirt. She was saying things like, another one is coming, joining you. And just to hear her repeat those words, I knew what she was saying. I knew what she was saying. I wanted him to be alive. That the plane is sitting there and he's probably sitting under a tree somewhere getting out of the rain. Those are the fantasies you like to believe, yeah, but they were fantasies.
At 9:09 a.m. on the 3rd of July 1963, Flight 441 from Auckland to Tauranga was miles off course, battling its way through severe turbulence. 4,500 feet below them was Errol Board, a fitter and welder at a quarry in Gordon, a small town in the shadows of the Kaimai Ranges. What's it like coming back here after all these years?
It's unbelievable. It's just about 45 years since I set foot on here.
Wow.
Last? Oh, well, it was shocking weather here. Absolutely shocking. And the locals, they only had one name when you had fierce winds and rain like it was then, and that they called it a Kaimai breeze.
At the time, the men were on a break in the smoko room.
I went over to the workshop to cook up a bit of soup and that because it was a cold day and I hadn't had breakfast. And when I'm coming back, I've got this pot of soup and I heard a plane. I recognised it as a twin engine and a DC-3, and it came in right on the side of the hill, just not far from the quarry, from Pyro end. and I noticed that the engines were roaring, and I'm standing out there, it's raining, it's cold, and I was thinking to myself, they think they're on the other side of the Kaimai Range and they're turning off the mountain. And I reckon they were flying into it. And sure enough, they just veered around slightly to their left, but I just heard woof. I went over to the smoko room and I said to the guys, I think I've just heard a plane crash.
Errol was so concerned about what he'd heard, he called the police in nearby Matamata.
And he must have rung Tauranga, and sure enough, there was a plane was overdue. And I said, well, I believe it's crashed, and I think I know pretty much where it is. Not too long after, the police came out, and there's search and rescue people arriving, and Paul Motley was the cop from Matamata at the time. He said, can you show me on this map where you think that plane is? And he opened the map up, and I put a mark on it where I thought it had landed.
Because of his local knowledge of the area, it was agreed that Errol would lead an initial search in the ranges.
They asked how long I thought it would take to reach the area, and I told him probably about 2 or 2.5 hours. And he said, well, it's such and such a time now, and you make sure at that time you turn around and come back. No matter where you are, we don't want to lose you too, you see. So we made our way up there, and sleet and rain was coming across pretty near horizontal. The time came to turn back, and I said to two of the chaps, I said, you know, I think I can smell something burning. And we were that close, and the wind was blowing that hard, you didn't know exactly where that smell was coming from, but you had a rough idea it was just slightly further into the ranges, you know.
Did you think there could be people alive up there?
In my mind, that was number one. If there was any way you could save some lives, that was the ultimate thing that would have had some satisfaction.
While Errol and his team were on foot, several planes were searching from the air. But low cloud and severe turbulence meant they had to abandon the search. Throughout the day, searchers arrived from all over the area. By the time Errol returned to the quarry at 5:30 p.m, it had been transformed into a primary staging post for a massive search and rescue operation. The Army, St John's Ambulance and hundreds of volunteers had all been mobilised.
Around the quarry itself, I don't know, I'd guess there was a couple of 200 or 300 people arrived. But it was raining and muddy, and you couldn't have found much more unpleasant place. It looked like a stock sale with a bunch of farmers in sou'wester hats and raincoats. It was just, and gumboots.
By the end of the first day, searchers still hadn't found the missing aircraft or the 23 passengers and crew on board. The next morning, something new arrived. A Pioneer pilot landed at the quarry in one of these, a helicopter. Back in 1963, helicopters were new to search and rescue operations, and the pilot's offer of help was initially rejected. But when the weather lifted, he turned up anyway. That pilot was Mike Alexander. Tell me what it's like to fly one of these old birds.
Something you can trust. If it's properly maintained, it will go and go and go. It's not a smooth machine, it's a noisy machine, but it bloody goes.
At 11:58 a.m, there'd been a possible sighting of wreckage by the Air Force. Without verification and specific coordinates, it would take hours to reach the location on foot. So Mike took the initiative, jumped into his helicopter and flew up into the ranges himself.
Cloud, blowing, raining, nasty wind, and it was a case of following the ridge all the way with your nose right on the ground. Otherwise, if you were a little bit higher, you'd lose sight of the ground and it was all over. Bearing in mind that the guys, the bystanders, had told me where they thought it was, that was a big help. Without that, you could have spent a long time looking. And right where these guys reckoned it was, there it was.
We can now see the sailplane of the crashed liner. Just a small heap of metal, one wing folded over the rear part of the fuselage and the tailplane still visible. The whole plane is nosed into a very small ravine, only a matter of 100 feet from the top of the ridge. And this ridge is the highest ridge in this part of the Kaimais, and it looks from here very much as though he almost made it.
But were there any survivors?
Everybody knew what they had to do, so they did it. And this is the amazing thing that you get with rescues. Here you get the glory seekers when it's not their glory to seek. You ignore them. The real people got their sleeves rolled up and they're into it.
Mike had proved the helicopter's worth finding the wreckage. His next job was to get the rescuers to the crash site. And what they'd find was worse than anyone had imagined. The crash of NAC Flight 441 on a midwinter's morning in 1963 galvanised a small community. At the height of the search, almost 250 volunteers were involved, including over 40 locals. The 15 pupils of Gordon School were sent home and the building became the catering and accommodation headquarters for the search. The wreckage of the DC-3 had finally been located on the second day of searching. But until rescuers could reach the crash site, it was still unknown if there were any survivors. A group of men, mostly police, would be the first to find out. Leading this team was 33-year-old police constable Laurie Cobb.
Everybody was desperate to find out if there was anybody left alive. That was the big thing that was pushing us all the time.
At around 10 a.m. on the third day of searching, Laurie and his team were flown into the area by Mike Alexander. To get to the actual site, the team had to crash through thick bush, and in the end, the going was too tough.
We finished up walking around the top of the hill and come back out to where we were, so that's when I said, right, let's get in the chopper.
On their second attempt, Mike Alexander flew down the ridge and hovered closer to the wreckage. It was a risky manoeuvre, but they had to climb out and jump from the helicopter's skid. What they found must have been truly horrific.
I arrived at the scene of the wreckage at about 10 a.m. and the party comprised of 8 members, including a doctor, radio operator, 4 members of police and 2 members of search and rescue organisation. There were several charred bodies in plain view among the wreckage. Everything was all piled up and there was like all the noses burnt out and was all crushed up into a heap, and all the bodies seemed to be on the one side of the plane, when the impact must have heaved them.
Were they still in their seats?
Well, there wasn't a hell of a lot left. Apart from there's one we found a few metres away from the crash site. He had burns on his clothing and his face and that. The Air Force doc examined him and he told us straight out, he said he wouldn't have lasted long.
They really had no chance.
No. He seems to think that he did live for a little while, but he said he wouldn't have survived the night. Now, even looking at these photos, it's hard to put it into words. There was one body when we recovered him, like all the clothing was burnt off them. And while we removed him, we actually found something under his arm, and it happened to be his plane ticket. So that was one that you could identify straight off. It wasn't pleasant, but you just had to get in and do it.
By dusk that day, most of the bodies had been recovered. With night approaching and the weather deteriorating, Mike Alexander made one last flight to bring Laurie back to the search headquarters. That night, 2 days after the crash, the country was in mourning. Before an investigation could begin, the families and loved ones of the 23 dead had to be notified. One of the victims, travelling salesman Graham Flyger, had been sitting in seat 4D. His girlfriend at the time was a young Julie Harris.
My sister rang us at home and told Mum. Said a client had come into the bank and said that she just heard that there was an aircraft missing between Auckland and Tauranga. And my mother didn't want me upset, so she sort of growled at my sister and said, "Don't be silly, you know, it'll be fine. Won't be his." It was cold. It was a really cold day, and so we had the heater on, I remember, in the living room, and I was in my dressing gown. We just sat by the radio. We had that going the whole time, and just waiting for any news every hour that might come out that was new or a bit hopeful or able to give us some sort of sense of what was going on.
Must have been just devastating.
Well, I didn't know what to do with myself, really. I thought, well, it's missing, but I'm sure they find it. I'm sure it's going to be okay. So I was just positive for a little while until we finally got the next lot of news to say they have seen where the aircraft has crashed and that it looked bad. It looked as though there may not be any survivors.
Too young.
Too young, yes.
Do you remember when he first asked you out? Was it a surprise? Was it?
Yeah, it was a surprise because I thought, oh, he likes me. And it was to a dance. In those days, you'd spend all Saturday with your curlers in, getting the hair ready to go out that night, you know. So I got all dolled up and, it kind of went from there because we had a great time. I really liked this dress because it was nicely folded there. It was in pale blue, showed off your nice waist there and then came out into a very pretty skirt. And I felt really good that night. You know, it wasn't love at first sight. It was a friendship that grew into a very important relationship.
Graham worked as a salesman for a well-known Australian lingerie company, Burley.
His grandfather was a tailor, so he made all his suits for him privately, and he always looked very smart and spick and span, which is pretty important for somebody in that line.
Graham's job took him all over the North Island, and he regularly caught flights to the smaller provincial towns. On the night before he left for his trip, Graham stopped in to say goodbye to Julie, who was sick with glandular fever.
Well, I was in bed and I was in the dark because that was most comfortable. I was just lying there feeling most miserable. And he came round after tea and said, well, I've just come round to see you because I'll be away for this week, of course. And turned up with this beautiful bouquet of flowers. And I said, yep, have a good flight. And away he went. I didn't understand what it would be like for an aircraft to actually be absolutely in pieces and smithereens and bodies just being flung out or lying there, thinking, I don't believe it, I can't understand this.
The flowers must have been quite a big thing to... I don't know, it gets me when you talk about that, because there must be a point when you do actually have to throw them away.
I think my mother did that. We took 1 or 2 out as they gradually died, so that you still had some there to look at. And then I think she finally said, no, I think they need to go out. You realise that that was final. That was final.
It seems to me that the crew and the passengers of Flight 441 were in the wrong plane, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The DC-3 just didn't have the power to get them out of trouble. An iconic but ageing plane, why did NAC continue to use them when newer aircraft were already in service? At the Classic Flyers Museum in Tauranga, I meet an expert on NAC and the DC-3.
The DC-3 was an aircraft that had some years under its belt, but I think the pilots had an affection for the DC-3. Even the younger pilots who may not have been wartime pilots, they knew what this aircraft meant to the psyche of New Zealanders and the free world because of the way this aircraft had contributed particularly to the victory of World War II.
The DC-3 started life and proved its worth as a military plane, but took on new roles after the war, including that of a passenger airliner. When the war ended, New Zealand found itself with a surplus of both aircraft and crews to fly them. So the government came up with a plan to convert the planes for commercial use and retrain the pilots. This worked well up until the end of the 50s.
At that time, the friendships and the Viscounts were also being introduced, but NAC realised that the DC-3s were going to have to last through until maybe 1970. But the public were not very happy about having these utilitarian DC-3s with basic seating, bland colours. So NAC decided in 1962 that the DC-3s were due for a kind of a makeover. And after a competition, they decided they'd be called DC-3 Skyliners.
Wow, and this is it here, right?
That's it there.
Absolutely beautiful looking machine.
And they decided to name the first 2 Skyliners after the twin cities in Hawke's Bay, Napier and Hastings. So ZKAYZ was the second Skyliner, and after a 3-week conversion was rolled out in March 1963. Used by NAC as their promotional aircraft. So professional air-to-air photography focused on this beautiful looking ZKAYZ, the new DC-3 Skyliner. This is the NAC airline review. So this is the magazine that's in the back of the seats.
And the interior is quite luxurious.
Isn't it? With sort of a Formica end wall there. The colours, subdued colours of the 1960s, and the hostess wearing her beautiful glamorous uniform. Again, a glamorous occupation in those days, so a warm smile, personal service, and quite often, people were flying for the first time. So on a provincial flight like Auckland to Tauranga, the hostess would know there'd be 1 or 2 people on the flight who'd maybe never been up before.
But no one knew what tragic fate awaited this very plane just a few months after these photos were taken. Richard, I've got a seating plan here, which you could probably tell me a little bit about.
We can see that, of course, Captain Inchmarch in the front left-hand seat with Peter Kissel, the co-pilot. And it's interesting seeing where people were seated. So of the passengers, the majority were actually going to Gisborne, and Gisborne was, hard hit. There was 9 or 10 of these passengers going to Gisborne.
What was the experience of the flight crew?
Captain Len Inchmarch was 35 years of age, but with considerable experience, so had more than 6,500 flying hours. He was generally considered a calm, reasoned, reliable captain who had a bright future ahead of him. The co-pilot, Peter Kissel, had even more experience. and was the second most experienced co-pilot that NAC had, with 10,000 flying hours. So in terms of, a DC-3 flight in 1963, these two were well qualified and well experienced.
And to help me with this, you've done all types of aviation, from Air Force flying P-51 Mustangs, Vampires, into airlines flying all sorts of airliner jets, retiring on the 747-400, and I know you've got a connection with this accident.
Well, I do. I've worked in accidents investigation branch with Paddy O'Brien. I believe his findings are right on the money.
And these are the documents the pilots used to plan that last fateful flight. So can you walk me through them?
Well, they'd see that there's a low situated northeast, and the line of travel is down across their route, so the weather's going to get worse rather than better. And the strongest wind that they were expecting to encounter on the way to Tauranga was 35 to 40 knots.
But instead the pilots encountered twice that, 70 to 80 knot winds. That's almost 150 kilometres per hour. And as they were approaching the Kaimai Ranges, they were enveloped in cloud, meaning they had little, if any, visibility.
Not being able to establish how they're tracking across the ground is critical to where they finished up. And they finished up not on the Tauranga side of the Kaimais, but on the westerly side of them. And since they were on the wrong side of the Kaimais, the wind must have been considerably stronger than this forecast value that they were given.
These days, pilots have a lot of navigational aids like GPS, weather radar and moving maps. But in the 1960s, the DC-3 had very little in the way of modern electronics.
They did in terms of the radio compass, which is a device in the aeroplane that points at a radio beacon situated along the route or at the point of departure or at the destination.
So you're sitting on the flight deck, flying the aeroplane, and there's a needle that's actually pointing at this beacon, which in this case was Tauranga.
Yeah.
And they thought they were on the Tauranga side of the Kaimais, which is flat ground, and they had no hills in front of them that could be a danger. That radio compass would have shown them the direction to Tauranga Airport, but not their actual position. Unaware they'd been blown onto the wrong side of the Kaimai Ranges, the crew of Flight 441 thought they were safe to begin their descent.
Tauranga, we are 2 minutes out. Request descent to 4,100 feet. Alpha Yankee Zulu, this is Tauranga. You are clear to join Tauranga at 4,100 feet.
At that point, they ran into incredible downdraft off the Kaimais.
I know from gliding around the Kaimais, when the wind is strong and it hits the side of the hill, it's got to go up because it can't go down because it's ground here. And once it goes up, it comes over the hill and flows down. And if you get into that down-going wind, it's going to take you down, and it's going to be as rough as all hell when you've got wind at sort of 70 to 80 knots.
Where's all this turbulence coming from? And then suddenly they start going down, and the evidence is quite clear that they were under takeoff power. So the crew obviously reacted to the sink rate and applied takeoff power. But the poor old DC-3 is not up to a 2,000 foot a minute rate of climb. The takeoff power wouldn't have prevented them sinking below their minimum safe. And tragically, that was just too low by a small margin to clear the Kaimais.
Sitting in the cockpit of the DC-3 where the accident unfolded kind of brings it all to life for me. They would have been cruising along at 140 knots We know there was an incredibly strong northeasterly breeze blowing that would have been shooting air over the top of the Kaimais, and the turbulence would have been incredibly alarming in the airplane. They would have been bounced all over the place. They would have been looking at the vertical speed indicator, seeing that the airplane was going down. We know they went to full power, so that pilot would have selected the throttles to full to get as much power as they could. And we also know that looking out the front, they would have seen absolutely nothing. There are only a few DC-3s still flying in New Zealand, and I brought Susan Borrie, the widow of co-pilot Peter Kissel, to the New Zealand Warbirds DC-3 at Ardmore Aerodrome. It's the first time she's ever set foot in one of these aircraft. How does it feel sitting in the seat that, it all happened?
It's very small, and I never ever thought I would be in the cockpit of the DC-3. Never. And I don't know where the captain sat. Did he sit there where you are? Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting in the, It's a bit strange. It's lucky that pilots tend to be small, because I don't know how you'd fit in if you were 6 foot plus. Peter had little hands, little feet, and he would have fitted in beautifully. Fantastic. Yeah. I'm very happy to be here, and I think he'd be happy too.
Peter had always been passionate about flying. When he turned 18, he joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Returning to New Zealand after the war, Peter continued his passion for flying and retrained for commercial air service.
Flying with NAC he loved. He used to say, this isn't work at all, this is just like playing golf.
Peter went on to become one of the most experienced first officers at NAC, but his real aspiration was to become a captain.
And he sat the captain's exams twice and didn't get anywhere with them. I think towards the end of 1962, he was thinking of changing jobs. Once he'd become an established family man, he felt he wanted to be more at home, I think.
On July the 3rd, 1963, Peter said goodbye to his young family, leaving for a routine flight. But with the news of the crash, Susan's happiness was torn apart.
Your rock had gone, totally gone from under your feet. What do you do next? What kept me going was having to make formula in babies' bottles and change nappies and talk to little ones. And the kids didn't know. They were too young to know what was happening. How do you tell a 2-year-old that you're not going to see Daddy again? But I felt that his memory lives on in his kids. His son Adam is very much like his old man in his sense of humour, which is great to see. I love to see that carrying on into generations later on. It's wonderful, yeah.
Tell us what was done with Peter's ashes.
Well, we had been on a holiday before Adam was born to New Caledonia. A lot of his mates had been buried there, and we went and we found some of them from World War II, and I thought, seeing we'd had such a lovely holiday there, that would be the perfect place for his ashes to be scattered. So that's where he is, amongst his old friends.
When the body of passenger Tutu Grace finally arrived home, it was in a coffin draped with the New Zealand flag.
We were happy to have a body. The coffin was very light, so there's probably only some of him, burnt. He's burnt away.
Like so many families that suffer the experience of losing a loved one, the Grace family needed to see where Tutu had died. So 3 weeks after the crash, 13 of the whānau trekked up to the crash site in search of closure.
Walking up that hill a mile away from there, the stench was so bad. You could smell death. It was really putrid. Then when we got there, there's papers, there's clothing, there's all sorts of things strewn about the place, and bones. You know, I was hoping that I might see some part of him lying down there. Because he had a carving of one of his arms. It was a lady with a snake twirled around this lady, and I thought I might find that. Yeah, I don't know why, but, you know, young mind. But there was only little bones here and there. At that time, we were getting closure. We're starting to accept what has happened to our brother.
To get a better sense of this disaster, we're tramping up to the crash site itself. It's cold, but unlike July the 3rd, 1963, it's sunny, a stark contrast to the conditions the searchers faced all those years ago. Due to the rugged terrain, the wreckage has never been removed. To discourage sightseers and souvenir hunters, the Army later attempted to bury what remained with explosives. As we approach the crash site, the wind picks up, cloud fills the sky, and the temperature plummets to freezing, just as it did in July 1963. The respect I have for the men that climbed up here in an attempt to rescue all those years ago is just indescribable. The conditions are harsh. Even now the weather is turning for the worse. And just over there is where the DC-3 finished. And you can see just another 100 feet higher and they would have scraped over the top and been none the wiser. But unfortunately, all down the hill here are pieces of a Skyline DC-3. The wreckage of this once proud aircraft is a terrible reminder of the 23 lives lost here. The crash was a case of incredibly bad luck. The pilots were off course in atrocious weather, and once they began their ill-fated descent, the DC-3 didn't have the power to get them out of trouble. The disaster on July the 3rd, 1963 is still the worst aircraft accident on New Zealand soil. Long may it remain so.